day after my 18th birthday, my sister was admitted to a psychiatric unit. Sarah spent the next 9 months at the hospital, and I spent the majority of my freshman year running out of class to catch a train from Grand Central to White Plains. I would flash my ID to the guard at the entrance of Unit 6 South and sign the visitor's log as Sarah's sister, a badge that I wore proudly. For 9 months, I brought Sarah boxes of her favorite foods and takeout containers, held her hand while we sat quietly in the dining room, and played poor renditions of Beatles songs for her on the piano in the recreation room. I nodded my head every time a doctor assured me that she would be out by the end of the month, but I watched the light in Sarah's eyes steadily dim. I missed who my sister was before she went into the hospital. Those were the longest 9 months of my life. After the fact, I spent a lot of time wondering what we can do with the baggage that hangs around our experiences. Sarah was discharged from the hospital, but I continued to struggle to articulate myself to the people around me. I felt distant and frustrated, and I wanted more than anything for Sarah's story to be worth something. My junior year at Gallatin, I learned about something called narrative psychology in a class I was taking, and decided to craft my academic concentration around it. Now, by way of a very fortunate accident, it turned out that synthesizing my own lived experience into an academic narrative awarded me a sort of release. So suddenly, I had something to do with my experiences and somewhere to put them. I've spent the past 3.5 years thinking about stories and their healing qualities. I wonder, what if Sarah could share her story, much like I am with you all today? What could happen if we heard the voices of those actually affected by mental illness? I'd like to talk to you today about why stories are compelling and what happens when we share them. So, if we return for a moment to the earliest recorded work on literary theory, Aristotle identifies 2 operative causes for the poetic art. The first is that the habit of imitating is congenital to human beings since childhood, and so is the pleasure that all people take in works of imitation. Aristotle defines catharsis as the key element of a successful story. Catharsis is the emotional release we feel when we encounter a narrative. It serves personal and social functions. By tuning us into the sense of compassion, we are able to better understand ourselves and the world around us. Now, we are seeing these same ideas appear in works by modern thinkers. The modern medical humanities remind us that everything is story, for story accounts for our identity, our goals, and our values. We can identify 3 core purposes for engaging in story. The first is that story teaches us empathy. By allowing us to see the world from various perspectives, we can think flexibly and creatively. Next, stories give us cognitive and emotional significance to our experiences. And lastly, stories connect us within social networks. We construct narratives in accordance with our environment and the culture around us, and in doing so, we can shape our identity. From a neuroscientific perspective, there are marked differences between the brain on fact and the brain on story. Basic information activates just 2 basic regions of the brain, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, which are responsible for speech and comprehension. The brain doesn't identify with the abstract quality of information, which is why you might struggle to remember a fact for an exam if you don't really care about the test that you're taking. Meanwhile, stories activate up to 7 total regions of the brain, including all 5 sensory cortices. This allows the brain to make emotional connections, which makes them easily encoded and then made meaningful. Cognitive science also accounts for our inbuilt capacity to share stories. By age 4, most of us develop something called the theory of mind, which is essentially your ability to put yourself in another person's shoes. It's the default means by which we navigate our social environment. Theory of mind is how you're able to ascribe mental states to other people, which is why you care about and can share the feelings of others. So, what does any of this have to do with therapy and healing? Narrative has always informed our medical practice. When you think about it, after all, these professionals are responsible for attending to and interpreting narratives, sometimes in the form of symptoms and other times as actual words. So if we take a look back at the history of psychotherapy, that too has always been a narrative process. The recreation of the self as narrative has been a therapeutic goal since Freud's conception of psychoanalysis in the early 20th century. Freud is commonly regarded as someone who vacillated between the sciences and the humanities, which is just evidence of why it's important to integrate narrative into psychological practice. Freud also can be regarded as a founding father of narrative healing. By interpreting memories, dreams, and unconscious thoughts into coherent narratives, he helped to give his patients meaning. Next, in the 1940s, cognitive behavioral therapy arose with psychologist Aaron Beck. CBT posits that our thoughts inform our behavior, and vice versa. We can exploit this relationship to heal maladaptive thoughts and behaviors that result in broken narratives. CBT acknowledges that there are both internalized stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and external stories that the world tells us about ourselves. And we can react to both of these to heal the incongruity that results in a broken identity. In the 1960s, humanistic therapy arose as a direct criticism of the shortcomings of psychoanalysis. The pioneers of this movement, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, posited that the goal of therapy should be a holistic approach that ultimately resulted in self-actualization. Maslow was known for believing that psychological illnesses were actually spiritual ailments that arose out of a lack of meaning. So what next? This brings us to 1990 in New Zealand, the birthplace of narrative therapy. Freud, Beck, and Maslow were all narrative scholars to some degree, whether they knew it or not. But here we have two family therapists, Michael White and David Epstein, who were self-proclaimed narrative experts. A key difference in our understanding of therapy throughout time is this. We have always followed a sort of narrative understanding with therapy, but now we are actively exploiting the brain's pre-existing capacity for telling stories. So, what is narrative therapy? Narrative therapy is a collaborative and non-pathologizing approach to counseling that centers people as the experts of their own lives. White and Epstein believe that the stories we tell about ourselves determine the meaning we ascribe to experience. We have problems when the stories that the world represents about us are different than the ones that we have about ourselves. Therapy then becomes a process of restoring. White and Epstein don't ascribe to the disease model of medicine, although this is not intended to be an attack on traditional modes of therapy. Instead, we are merely attempting to reveal its blind spots. With narrative therapy, the person is not the problem. The problem is the problem. This externalizing process allows us to undermine unproductive conflict, which is tremendous for a person who might be suffering from some kind of psychological ailment. In addition, the actual practice of narrative therapy is very different than what you might be more familiar with, letter writing. These are self-constitutive practices that restore power to the individual in the therapy, and they run counter to the traditional medical practice you might be more familiar with. Patients tend to be represented by a case file of documents, and when you think about it, that's pretty ridiculous to think that you could ever represent a complex person within just a couple of pieces of paper. Here, patients are invited to share their thoughts about themselves, and then family members and friends are also invited to share their letters that add dimension and perspective to the narrative being constructed. So, what happens when we engage in narrative therapy? There are 5 key goals that we can identify and 5 results that come of this particular process. The first is that it privileges all aspects of lived experience, positive or negative, real or imagined, past, present, or future. Next, it restores a sense of authorship to the person whose life we're talking about. That means that you are the master of your own relationships and experiences. Narrative therapy also provides a sense of continuity in a life. By ordering events and structuring them in a linear fashion, it's easier for us to make meaning out of the things that happen to us. Narrative therapy also allows us to see problems from multiple perspectives. If there are an infinite number of ways of looking at a problem, then there are an infinite number of ways of fixing it. And lastly, narrative therapy encourages the perception of a changing world, which allows us to dream beyond the walls of the hospital, so to speak. So, dismissing the power of personal narratives omits an essential voice in the conversation about mental health. I believe that we can access the general outcomes of integrating narrative understanding of psychology on 3 levels: communal, relational, and personal. Psychology research and mental health treatment can be tremendously improved by including the voices of those living with mental illness. Reading memoirs and autobiographies of people who are living with mental illness can help us foster empathy and take away from the stigma that surrounds mental illness. In addition, a number of advocacy programs exist that create a safe space on the internet where people can discuss these issues and have an ongoing dialogue about what it means to live with a mental illness or to have a family member with a mental illness. I then refer back to my relationship with my sister and my ongoing attempts to understand what life must be like for Sarah. My hope is that someday, Sarah will have the opportunity to share her story, which will make it possible for her to heal according to her own terms in a way that will allow her to incite healing in a way that is natural. How we heal is implicit within the unique story of our lives. Thank you for bearing witness to my story.